So I started, my very first mask was sort of based off of this shape, it was just a mask that I bought at a Halloween store or something. It had fabric on top of it. I ended up like ripping the fabric off and just using this mask shape as the template. It's a little misshapen around the nose area because I've been using some ironing techniques and applying some heat to it, so it's a little bit melted, but it still gives me a good idea of the overall shape that I wanted to make my masks. The forehead needs to kind of slope backwards, the nose needs to come out, the cheeks are sort of rounded. So to try to get all of these shapings in place, you have to form your non-woven stitching base in a similar way. So my basic idea is to try to get this non-woven to sit on the mask base. So I kind of went from there. I started with cutting out one of these shapes in the mask inspiration PDF that I sent you guys. This is based on a same size mask base as the plastic one that I have. And I'm going to use this as a template to draw onto my actual piece of non-woven stitching base. So I'm going to fold it in half and cut out the eyes at the same time so that I know they're identical and symmetrical. I'm going to use a smaller pair of scissors for this actually. I'm trying to cut this a little bit neater than the outside edge because it's just an area of like finer detail. The outside edge I can always refine later. Alright, and those eyes were not symmetrical as was drawn on there. So this is my basic mask shape. This is the one I used for your guys' templates with slits and darts kind of cut out here. So initially when I did these, I kind of just eyeballed where I wanted these to be. So this is about this area here. And I tried a couple times to figure out the distance I would need here. It's about 1/2 inch. And it's in this side of the forehead area, like to one side of the face. So I just go ahead and cut that out. And then down on the cheek, I went between having this be a place that gets spread out or sucked in by sewing together. I ended up with going with the spreading out version. And again, this was something I just kind of ballparked to down in this section, sort of reaching from the eye outward to the cheek. And I put these together to just cut this slit. And then the nose needs to be cut and extra Peltex needs to be added so that this shape can flare outward because the nose pokes out. So in order to fit this on someone's actual face, there needs to be this extra space for their nose. So I try to fit my flat paper on here. You see what happens in the nose area when I try to form it flat, or form it to the shape of the mask base. Now that I've got this basic template cut, I'm going to trace it onto my non-woven stitching base, just using a Sharpie. So I'm going to trace it including the darts and the slits that I made. Just tracing around the outside edge. I'm trying to get into this slit here to make that line. Same here. Oh, I forgot the forehead one. I want to do a forehead one as well, but it's easy enough just to draw a line on the template there. We'll cut that. And then I gotta trace the eyes. Alright, so once I do that, then I can just start cutting this guy out. I'm going to just cut along this outside edge and then cut the darts later. And if you plan on keeping your white base light in color, you might want to use a lighter color Sharpie for this part. I used the dark Sharpie to so it would be easier for you guys to see. But you can definitely use darker color if you're covering it up with fabric or dyeing it. So now I'm going to cut the slits. I'm cutting on the outside of these lines for these darts. Alright. The eye holes can be tricky. It's good to use a short, sharp pair of scissors or use a beading awl to pierce a hole on both ends before cutting. That's just going to help as you're cutting the shape when you get to those corners. And then start cutting inward from there. You can always make these eye holes bigger. This is just sort of a good size to start with. If you're adding fabric or doing something like that, you want to make sure when you're adding the fabric, if you're wrapping it around, that you're not losing too much of the eye hole. So try putting it up to your face if you can, just holding the fabric in place to make sure it's still big enough to see through. Alright, so that's the basic flat mask shape. Now for the nose, I know that I want this to kind of stay flared out like this, so I have to fill in the space so that I can, this shape can stay sort of flared out, three-dimensional. Same thing with these pieces down here. I know I want them spread apart a little bit like this, so I have to cut a piece of non-woven and stitch it down so that it holds these in place. Up here, I'm just going to bring these together and stitch where they overlap. And same thing up here, I'm just going to overlap this slightly and stitch where it overlaps. So I could do those first actually. I don't have to cut anything for those. So you could start from the back or the front since both surfaces are going to be you're going to be adding things on top of them. But I knotted my thread, stitched from back to front, and then front to back. And what I like to do is kind of try to stitch right on the edge of the non-woven to make the edge a little less apparent, kind of pull the edge down. So it makes the whole thing a little flatter. And these can be really rough stitches because you're going to be beading on top of this. So that beading is going to be just more stitches reinforcing these folds. And then I'm going to just anchor this thread by skimming through the non-woven on the back a few times, cutting it. Now for these guys, I got to hold these pieces together while I anchor my thread. I'm not going to tie a knot, I'm just going to stitch back and forth a few times. So I'm going to turn this again, and on the front just try to stitch along this edge, between the edge and the other part of the mask, to pull that edge down so that it's less noticeable on the surface. If you do have a sewing machine and you're able to sew one of the wide stitches on that seam, that works really well. But this is the way to do it by hand. And I'm just going to anchor this by stitching back and forth a few times. So to do this cheek area, I want this dart to kind of remain open after I sew it, because I want the cheek to sort of come out away from the eye, like how cheekbones kind of fill out the face and the eye is usually kind of set back. So I kind of like to have a good piece in this area. Not only does it reinforce, but it puffs up this area a little bit more. So I kind of just try to transfer this shape to a scrap piece of paper. And it can be rough because you can always trim away the edges later. So I'm cutting this out of the paper. And then I'm going to trace it onto a piece of non-woven. And you can keep these paper templates and use them many times before they get too soaked with marker to use anymore. But so there, I'm tracing my template. Cutting this out of the non-woven stitching base now. And you can also use that same template for the other side of the face. I would just turn it over on the back side for the other side of the face. So this will sit kind of like here. And I'm going to work from the back side because I want this dart to remain open while I sew. I'm going to start with this side here. I got to anchor my thread. You can anchor either from the front or the back. It really doesn't matter because you're going to be covering up the entire surface with beads anyway, or fabric or whatever. So it doesn't matter if you have little threads hanging. So I'm just securing this side first, and that dart is closed, but I'm going to kind of hold it open as I work my way toward that side. Just making big stitches back and forth. And I'm trying to sort of follow the contour of this extra piece I've cut. See, it didn't line it up quite with the eye on the front. That's okay. Just gonna go with it. And if you can do that little trick where you stitch down the edges to make them flatter, make the seams sort of blend together, you can do that as well. You can always do a second pass around after you get this stitched in place to do that part. And I'm stitching near the eye hole. I'm not stitching too close to the eye hole because I may decide later on that I want to trim away more of the eye hole, make a larger hole. And my needle just came off my thread, and that's a good place to stop. So then I would just weave in, secure my thread there with a knot, or just by weaving back and forth a bunch of times. And I'm trimming away the excess there. So now I have my cheek shape. Alright, now the nose is probably the trickiest part of this whole piece because we want the nose to sort of come out like this. We need to fill in the space and sort of reinforce this so it stays that way. The Peltex wants to just stay flat. but we want to add some extra non-woven in here. And I kind of just cut a piece of paper to follow the shape here, this sort of arch. I wanted to cut it so that I'm not interfering with the eye holes. I'm coming right up to the eye holes and going down toward the cheeks a little bit on each side. So I cut this little scrap of paper, and I traced and cut out a piece of non-woven from that template. So now I'm looking at this to get kind of an idea of how wide this dart needs to be spread apart in order to fit to the face. And it's almost a ½ an inch here, a little shy of ½ an inch, between 1/4 and ½ an inch. So I'm just going to try to mimic that when I add this. So I like to do this part from the underside because it's easier for me to push this extra piece of non-woven up into the dart and hold it in place like that while I work. So I'm going to hold on to one side and kind of let the other side go for now. As long as that one side is, I'm pinching it firmly from where I saw that the position is going to work well, and I'm going to start stitching that in place, sort of following that contour I've drawn on the nose and the shape of the extra piece from the back. I'm working my way up toward the top of the bridge of the nose, still firmly pinching the pieces in place so they don't shift. That's very important. Alright, now when I get to the bridge of the nose here, I'm going to reposition this extra piece of non-woven I've added so that it's very firmly planted up here. And I'll stitch in this area of the bridge of the nose. Oops, my needle came off my thread. Alright, so I'm just holding this firmly in place while I stitch the bridge area of the nose. I've got my non-woven inserted up here far enough that I don't see too much of a gap there. If you get a little bit of a gap there, that's okay. You can always fill it in with a little piece of non-woven later. Since the stuff is pretty flexible, you can kind of stitch it in place, and if you need it to sort of melt away from one layer to the next, just make really tight stitches, and you can kind of compress it with those tight stitches as you work. I keep losing my thread. Okay. Alright, so I worked all the way down here now. I'm going to just weave back and forth. The reason I'm just making really big rough stitches is that this is going to all get covered with beads later. I'm going to be sewing on this thing like crazy. So all the parts that are sewn together now are going to get sewn together even more and reinforced even more later on just by adding the beadwork. So now I've got this sort of, it's sort of a crease here, which can be fine. It'll probably soften as you add beads later on. And I'm trimming away this excess non-woven here. You can cut this shape if you cut away any of the stitches that you do. Just make sure to go back and stitch a couple times beyond where you cut so that your piece can stay together and not completely fall apart. Another thing you can do to address this nose area, if you want it to be a little smoother in shape, you can place it on a mask base and use an iron and just kind of iron in these areas. The iron will help kind of melt the fibers of the Peltex momentarily. I put it on like the highest heat and just stick the nose of the iron in these areas, and it kind of just helps the shape to stay in place the way you want it. So if you have it on a mask form or on something else that's rounded here, you can kind of make this a little rounder. Another thing I've done in the past, depending on how I'm going to treat the nose area, is I've added a little U-shaped piece of memory wire, like very strong steel wire that's hard to bend, just in this area here to reinforce the nose and make it keep whatever shape I want. You can bend it with pliers, it just takes a lot of force. So once you've bent the wire to the shape you like it, it's going to stay that way on the mask base. And with the treatment I usually do with the nose, where I just have long lines of beads sort of over the nose to just be an area that's not very visually interesting so your eye goes elsewhere. You don't have to worry about this gap here. There's sort of a gap where the seams are of the non-woven that was cut on the top layer. If you're doing a different treatment where you really need this surface to be flat, you can cut a triangular shape of non-woven stitching base the same shape as this triangle right here and stitch it on, and then you can kind of create a smooth surface from that. Alright, so I'm bringing my needle up from back to front. The knot should hold this in place if I don't pull too tight. I'm going to show you how I usually anchor the larger beads. So I've got a 4mm check round here, but you can use this technique for really any size large bead that you want to stitch in place. So I'm going to stitch down about the same width away as the bead itself, from front to back through the base. Oops. And I've caught my tail, I gotta pull that. So the bead kind of sits on the surface. You do see the thread on either side, but I don't find that this is too big of a deal. I'll often pick a thread that matches the beads, or I'll put several of these next to each other so that you end up not seeing the threads later on. And then I'm stitching up from back to front, sort of right in the same spot as that first stitch. If you're adding much larger beads, it's sometimes a good idea to stitch a couple millimeters away from the first stitch, which just anchors the large bead a little bit better. Then I'm stitching through that same bead again, and down through the non-woven stitching base from front to back, a couple millimeters away from the first spot. So that's 2 passes of thread through this bead, and if you look at the holes of the bead, you can see 2 little threads coming out of each hole and going into the non-woven stitching base. So this is a good secure way to attach larger beads. Another way to attach larger beads is to anchor them using anchor stitch. So that's when you pick up a large bead and then a smaller bead, like a size 15-0 seed bead, bring them down to the end of the thread, and then don't stitch back through the smaller bead. Make sure you skip over that, stitch just back through the larger bead, and then through the same spot in the base. And when you pull that tight, you get your larger bead held in place by that smaller bead. I like to do this when I'm adding larger beads and want sort of an organic look. I don't know what it is about the little bead on top, but it just kind of it gives it another little hint of color and shape when you're adding lots of these at the same time. So I've done this with several of my masks. See, it's just like a field of pearls here with these little 15-0s anchoring them. And I just kind of like the way it looks, and it gives a little more texture than adding the pearls in backstitch. I've done that on other masks as well. Like this guy, this vernal equinox headdress, which has fallen apart. The polymer clay flowers have fallen apart, but you can see that I've anchored a lot of different beads using that technique with the 15-0s, and I just love the texture of it. Adding beads like that is actually really fast too, so it's a nice way if you want to quickly fill up a space with beads and want sort of an organic look. That's a really fast way to achieve that. The next thing I want to show you is just basic back stitch. Alright, so this is basic back stitch. I like to do back stitch with seed beads when I'm adding long lines of beads, or to bead around a shape. Bead around either a shaped bead or a larger bead or a bezel. So the standard is like 2 bead back stitch. It makes the lines really neat. So I'm picking up 2 11-0s, stitching down through the beading base from front to back, then up through the beading base from back to front, just before that first bead. Then I'm going to stitch through those 2 beads again, and I'll pick up 2 more, of the same bead, stitch down about 2 beads away, then up from back to front between the first and second bead. So I'm stitching up like 3 beads back from where I just stitched down, and I'm trying to stitch right in between the 4th bead back and the 3rd bead back, which can be tricky to do. Sometimes takes quite a few jabs to get it right in the right spot. But the closer you can get to like the center of the hole of the seed bead, the neater your line is going to be. And then I'm going to stitch through those 3 last beads that I added. So then I'll just keep going with this. I would add 2 more beads and just keep going, doing the same thing again, stitching down, stitching up 3 beads back between the beads, and then stitching through the 3 beads again. You start at the start of where you want your line of beads to be. You're going to pick up a lot of beads at a time, so anywhere from 5, 6, 7 to, you could do 15, 20 beads at a time. I'm picking up this many beads. You can add the entire line of beads at one time if you want. You bring them down to the end of your thread. Try to take up the slack in your thread. Make sure there's not a lot of space between where your thread starts and that first bead. Lay them down where you want them to go. So this could be, in this case, I'm just kind of doing it on an open piece of non-woven. It could go in any direction. And then once I know where they're going to go, I kind of hold them down and stitch just beyond that last bead. Now, as is, this line of beads can move around. You may or may not want that to be the case. So with couching, you're going to stitch up a few beads back from where you stitched in, from back to front. You're going to stitch to one side of the beads. So unlike back stitch, where you're stitching kind of between 2 beads right where the hole is of the bead, in this case you kind of want to stitch just to the side, just to where the edges of the beads fall. But also, I am between 2 beads, like my thread is centered where the gap between these 2 beads is, but it's not actually in that space right where the other thread is. Because I'm going to stitch over that thread, I'm going to stitch down on the other side of these beads as close as I can to where the gap between those 2 beads actually is. I'm trying to stitch straight down so I can make sure that my needle accurately is going down on the other side of this line of beads between where those 2 beads meet. And then I'm going to pull my thread tight, making sure as I pull that the thread is going right between those 2 beads, and it's going to actually be holding the thread between the 2 beads down. So if I bend this, you might be able to actually see in there that there's that little thread, my little stitch I just made.
Mommy, I got here, Mommy.
Oh, sorry, honey. That little stitch I just made is right on top of the thread between the 2 beads. And you don't want to pull super, super tight. If you can kind of keep a medium thread tension, if you pull super tight, I'll show you what happens. It's going to make the line sort of buckle. But what you really want is the line to just stay straight. If you're going for just a straight line of beads to use this technique, you want like a medium thread tension. So then you would just repeat that in other places along the line of beads. So I'm going a few beads down here, coming up just to one side of this line of beads between where these 2 beads fall. And then I'm going to stitch to the other side of this line of beads. Pull this medium tight, and that's going to hold that line in place. So my initial row is going to be cylinder beads. You can also use seed beads for the initial row. It's kind of your choice. Cylinder beads lock together better for doing the peyote stitch, but I have used like size 11 seed beads for doing bezels as well. So you bring your thread out of the non-woven stitching base on the front side, close to the edge of the stone. I try to leave a little bit of space, like a millimeter of space between where my thread comes out and the stone. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. There we go. And this is where I'm going to do 2 bead back stitch with my cylinder beads. So I pick up 2, stitch down about 2 beads away, that distance away from where I first stitched, then stitch up right before that first bead, and stitch through those 2 beads again, and then just keep going, adding 2 beads, stitch down, and then up between the 3rd and the 4th bead back, and then through the 3 beads. So I'll just keep doing this all the way around, and the reason you definitely want to keep to 2 bead back stitch for doing bezels right off of the non-woven stitching base is you want to end up with an even count of beads in this initial row so that you can do even count peyote stitch. Alright, I'm coming up to the end of this initial row here, and I have a decision to make because it looks like I can only fit 1 more bead in this space, but of course I want to have even count peyote stitch for this bezel. So because I can see a little bit of space between these beads back here, I didn't quite stitch them as neatly as I would have liked. I'm going to attempt to squish 2 beads in that final space and hope that even if they look wonky at first, that they will even out as I start to do my row of peyote stitch. So I've got my 2 here. I'm going to actually stitch through this first bead, then stitch down through the base, and then up between these beads, 3 beads back, and then through those 2 added, and that first bead again. Alright, so it is a little wonky there, but I'm going to do a row of peyote stitch now and hope that it'll straighten out a little bit. So I pick up a bead, skip over the next bead in the initial row, and stitch through the bead after that. And I'll do that all the way around. After adding the final bead in the row, which I'm doing now, I'm going to step up through the first bead added in peyote stitch. And now I have to decide whether I'm going to switch to my smaller beads yet, or if I'm going to do another row with cylinder beads. And I think I'm sort of checking how high the stone is, and I'm checking like the fit of these cylinder beads up against the stone. I think I can actually do 1 more row with cylinder beads before I go to the smaller beads, which are going to be size 15 seed beads, Japanese size 15 seed beads. So I'll just peyote stitch this row, adding 1 bead between every up bead in the previous row. After adding that last bead, I'm stepping up through the first cylinder bead in the previous row. And now I'm looking at the side of the stone again, and it looks like from where my cylinder beads are coming up, the stone is really starting, the surface is really starting to curve in at this point, so I think I'm good to add the smaller size bead. That's going to make the bezel cup in even more around the stone. So I'm picking up a 15-0 and stitching through the next cylinder bead, just adding a single bead in each of these spaces. Should also mention, when you're doing these rows, my needle came off my thread, when you're doing these different rows with cylinder beads and then, or seed beads, and then smaller size beads, you can vary the colors. The bezel doesn't have to all be one color. You can create patterning by using different colors of beads in different rows, or one color bead in all the odd rows and an even color in the other rows. That'll give you a striping effect on the side of the bezel. The bezel itself can sort of have a design to it, if you like. Alright. And now I stepped up and got a little something weird happening here. I'm just checking my bezel. Sometimes weird stuff like this happens where threads get wrapped around and you can pull tight and fix it. But I'm happy with how that's forming to the shape of the cabochon. And I could add another row of these beads, but I kind of like the way it looks with just the dots of the blue-green bead against the gold. So I think I'm going to leave it like that. Oops. Bring your thread out of the base. Sorry, I just want to zoom in here a little bit. Pick up as many beads as you think you're going to want for like the longest part of the branch. So I have 7 size 11 seed beads here. And you can also add like an embellishment bead on the end, a bicone or a pearl or some other large bead, a size 8 seed bead, and then pick up either 1 or 3 smaller beads. These are 15-0s. And these are going to anchor that embellishment bead. So I'm going to stitch back through the embellishment bead, skipping over the 15-0s and down 2 or 3 11-0s in that first branch. And then sometimes you have to pull on the 15-0s and pull the thread to really get it to tighten up. And then I'll pick up another 2 11-0s, one of those bicones for embellishment, and 3 15-0s. There's no like exact number of beads to use when you're doing this. It's pretty open to just picking up as many as you want as you go along and using as many in each branch as you want. So there I've just tightened up the second one, and I kind of have to hold it in place to tighten it sometimes. I'll pick up 3 11-0s for this one, and a bicone, and 3 15-0s. And then bring them down to the end of the thread. Stitch back through the bicone and the 3 11-0s, and then through the last 2 beads in the initial branch and back into the base. So I've got one little guy right there. Sometimes it's fun to group these together, so it gives you this look of like grass or branches sort of growing out of the base. But that's the basic technique, and you can try varying it by changing the numbers of beads used in each branch. So when making a bead embroidery leaf, you want to start with a basic leaf shape in mind. And I'm just going to sort of draw a leaf shape. I like to have my leaves be kind of curved usually. And I'm going to draw a line down the center. It's not going to be dead center. It's going to be a little off to one side. And it's going to kind of go with the curve on one side of the leaf shape. So this would be something I would do on the top of my mask base or as a separate projection and then stitch it onto my mask base. And I might draw a bunch at a time, like I might draw a few next to each other and then cut them out. For the purpose of this demo, I'm just going to cut this one out and show you how to do it. So I'm going to cut along the outside lines. And discard the pieces that I cut. Alright, so for this technique, we're actually going to add edge beads first. So this is also a tutorial for how to do brick stitch edging if you don't know how to do that. When I do these beaded leaves, I'm doing the brick stitch edging first because I'm going to anchor my lines of beads to the edging. Oh, and actually I want to do this midline of beads first, so I'm not going to cover the whole thing, just so the demo goes a little quicker than it otherwise would, but I am going to add a backstitched row of beads right down that center line. And I'm just going to do this kind of quick and dirty for the demo, adding many beads at a time, more than I would add if I was doing this on a piece that I was going to be keeping. Oops. You can also add things like cup chain or that crystal banding on the center line. I have done that as well. If you want to just have a different kind of bead in there, you could add a row of pearls or some other larger bead. It doesn't have to be a seed bead, but this is what I've done just on occasion for this technique, is add seed beads. Whoops, that's too many there at the end, but I'm just going to go with it. I'm just trying to neaten up the row a little bit. So I'm going to show you what the technique looks like. What we're going for here is these bead embroidery leaves. In the case of these, I added a few different colors. I'm going to kind of show you just the basic technique using 2 colors for the lines of beads. So if you're using 2 different colors for the lines of beads, like alternating colors, which I like to do just to make the lines of beads more noticeable, is you're going to add your edge beads alternating the colors. So I'm going to start at the tip. I'm going to use a softer sort of mauve color and then a slightly brighter pink color. Actually, you know what? There's not enough contrast between those. I'm gonna use this mauve color and then the color I used for the line of beads. So to start brick stitch edging, you always pick up 2 beads and stitch about a bead's width away from where you started. You can go back to front or front to back, but I'm just trying to stay kind of close to the edge. And then I'm going to stitch back through that last bead I added. That first bead's going to sit funny until I stitch through it again. That's okay, that's to be expected. Now I'm going to, my thread's coming out of that darker bead, so I'm going to pick up a lighter bead because I want to alternate these colors. And I'm going to stitch back through that last bead added. And actually I work better in this direction, so I'm going to turn this over and just work from the back. This is one of the techniques I like to use to finish off the edge of a mask after adding the backing as well. And I'll often use larger beads, like size 8/0 seed beads, if my mask base plus my fabric backing ends up pretty thick. Sometimes the size 8/0s are just easier to, they're bigger, they cover up more of the edge than a size 11/0 like these would. Alright, so you want to go all the way down the edge with this technique. I'm probably going to stop before I get to the end, just so I can show you this technique of adding the lines of beads. So I'm going to stop there, but basically you would keep going till you get to the end of your non-woven piece if that's where you're stopping your leaf, or till it meets up with another leaf if you have another leaf attached. And then stitch into the last edge bead before the one your thread is coming out of to get back into the non-woven base without having a thread coming off that last edge bead. Alright, so if you want your leaves really puffy with a lot of dimension and texture to them, you can stitch another line of beads that's not going to be seen about halfway between the midline and those edge beads. And you don't want to bring them all the way up to the point, because up here you're not going to have as much room for your lines of beads, and you kind of want to decrease the puffiness from the center of the leaf to the tip. You don't want the tip to be, well, I don't like the tip to be super thick and puffy looking. I like to graduate the shape down a little bit. So these beads are just going to help prop up my lines of beads I add on top. I think I'm just going to add 2 more and then be done. Alright, so that's just going to create a little extra dimension. Now I'm stitching over to the tip just by stitching back and forth between the front and the back. And I'm going to bring my thread out of this first edge bead here. You can add a decoration on the edge beads at the same time if you like, or you can just not add anything as you stitch up and down these beads and leave them as is. I'm going to show you adding an extra bead on the edge. You can add a single bead, you can add 2 beads, you can add 3 beads. You get different effects depending on what you're doing, so that's something that can be fun to play with. So I'm just adding that single 15/0. Now when making these lines of beads, I'm going to be just picking up long lines of beads at one time. I'm going to be kind of trying to follow this direction where my lines of beads are starting higher up and going downward as I move them toward the midline, because if you look at like a deciduous leaf with veins, the veins usually kind of point downward toward the middle of the leaf. So I'm trying to mimic that shape when I do this. So I'm picking up enough beads to reach from where my thread is coming out of the edge bead to the midline in these just initial few rows, and trying to have them sort of angled in that direction. Then I'm going to stitch up from back to front next to that row of beads, but also a little further down to allow for the next row of beads. I'm allowing a little bit of space there. Here I think I can fit 3 beads between where my thread is coming out and the edge bead. Sometimes I try to line them up and see if that's going to work before I actually stitch through. So there's the next line of beads. I'm going to pick up my little embellishment bead for the edge and stitch into the next edge bead. And then here, looks like I can fit 3 again. Soon I'm going to start adding more beads than what I think is going to fit in that space. Like here. I'm going to stitch out here for the next line of beads. Now I think 4 is going to fit flat against the non-woven in that space. So I'm going to add a 5th. And that's going to make these beads puff up a little bit. See from the side, you can see they're kind of a little higher than the previous row of beads. I'm going to add my little embellishment bead here. And then this is where I'm meeting up with this middle line. I need to get enough beads to jump over that first bead in this line. So it sometimes takes a little trial and error once you get to that point. I'm thinking 5 will do it, but we'll see when I stitch down from front to back if that's enough. If it's not, I'll have to take this off and add another bead, but that looks like it fits well. So the same thing over here, and I know that this lighter color bead that I'm adding next is a Miyuki, and the darker color bead is a Toho. So I'm going to try 6 beads because it's about the same distance as the previous row, but the beads are smaller. So yep, 6 works good there. Add my little embellishment bead on the edge, stitch into that next edge bead. I'm going to try 5 again because that worked well in a similar sized space 2 rows back. Stitch down next to that lighter row. So this is just the process you do all the way down to the bottom part of your leaf where it meets up with other elements in your mask or where it meets up with other leaves that you're going to do. So what you'll end up is with this sort of 3-dimensional, sort of nicely textured leaf. And you can change the colors. You can do color gradients in each line of beads, like start with one color and mix the second color and then a third color as you work out to the edge. I've done that in different projects. This is a work in progress where I'm doing that with 4 different colors of beads. And in addition, in this example, I'm using size 15 O's between the rows of 11 O's. So there's different sizes of beads as well. When you do that, you do have to just add the same size 15 O seed bead on the edge when you do the brick stitch edge, edging. To add large stones to the mask, I like to bezel them first and then stitch the bezel onto the mask base. So in this case, I'm using size 11 cylinder beads or delicas to bezel this 12mm chaton. It has a pointed back here, so it really helps to have the bezel in place first and stitch the bezel to the base so that the bezel ends up less wonky this way than trying to stitch onto the base and create the bezel off of the base. So I think I have the right number of beads here. This is 28 size 11 cylinder beads. I've stitched through the first couple beads again to form this loop, and I'm leaving just enough of a tail to weave into the beadwork later and trim, or to use to attach the bezel to the mask base. So I'm going to do single drop peyote stitch. That's just the simplest form of peyote stitch. Pick up a bead, skip over the next bead in the loop, and stitch through the bead after that. So I've got those 2 beads stacked side by side, so I'm just going to repeat this all the way around. After adding the last bead and peyote stitch, I'm going to step up through the first bead added in this round that I'm finishing. So that puts my thread in place for the next row. Now generally with stones like this, there's either 3 or 4 rows of peyote stitch before adding a smaller bead. So I'm going to go ahead and start adding the smaller bead now and see how it works out. I'm adding a size 15-0 seed bead. I'm going to pick it up and stitch through the next up bead on the outside edge of this ring. And just repeat that all the way around. After adding the last bead in the row, step up through the first 15-0 added. If you pull tight at this point, you should start to see the bezel cup. Generally with stones 8 millimeters in size or larger, you need at least 2 rows of smaller beads, like size 15-0s, to work the inner rounds of the bezel and have them be able to hold the stone in place. So I'm going to add another row with these blue 15-0s. Same way as the first row. At the end of the row, I like to step up even if I am not adding another row, just to get the tension consistent and pull tight and see how it's really cupped in now. Now I'm going to check the fit on my stone by placing the stone in there. I think that's going to work out nicely. And it's hard to tell whether I'm going to have to add another row of cylinder beads to the back side or not, but that's where I'm going to weave down to now. So to get down to the spot where I have to add the next row, I'm going to stitch through the next 15-0 and then the next 3 cylinder beads all the way to the open side of the bezel. And I'm trying to figure out whether I need to add another row of cylinder beads or not, or if I can just add a row of 15s. I'm going to try just adding a row of 15s and try putting the stone in again to see if that holds the bezel in place well or not, if it's a good fit. So I pick up a 15 and stitch through the next cylinder bead. It's the same as before. Just one bead in each gap. So I've got that row on the back side of the bezel of 15s, and I'm going to check the fit against my stone by just placing my stone in there and pulling real tight on the thread. And it does look like it's going to be a really good fit. So I'm going to add one more row of 15s, holding the stone in place while I work. I want this to be secure, but I also know that this is going to be stitched to my mask, so the back of the stone doesn't have to be completely covered, because there's going to be that mask base against the back side of the stone. Alright, so I finished my second row of 15s on the back side of the bezel, and I've got the 3 rows of cylinder beads and the 2 rows of 15s on the front, and it fits really well. So what I'm going to do now to attach it to my mask base, I'm going to use this piece of non-woven as a surrogate for my mask base in this demo. But you can stitch these directly onto your mask base, or you can stitch onto a piece of non-woven and then stitch that onto your mask base. It just depends what you're doing. So generally what I do is I stitch between beads on the back side of the bezel and the mask base. In this case, I can see that the stone is like really pointy. So rather than just adding this as is, because it's going to tend to wobble because of how deep that point is, I'm going to stitch to my backmost row of cylinder beads, and I'm actually going to add another row of cylinder beads off of that row. I'm stitching in the ditch here where I'm adding these cylinder beads between beads in this last row, and they're sort of sticking out more. Those are the 2 I just added. So I'm just going to work this extra row all the way around. I'm going to step up at the end of the round through the first extra bead I added to the outside of this row. So you can see those all sticking out there now. Sometimes this one row is enough to add some extra depth to the bezel to make it down to the non-woven, but I can see it's still not making it down, and there is a little bit of give in the non-woven. You can kind of get the point of some stones to sit in there and not affect the surface too much, but you really don't want to press down too much. Another option is to take a piece of non-woven, cut it out like a donut, like a ring, where you cut out the middle and then cut out a circle. So there's a hole in the middle of the circular piece of non-woven. You place the bezel onto there and then sew that to the bezel, then sew that whole thing in place on the mask base. But that's one option. My preferred option is to just do this with beads. So I'm adding a second row here to my extra row of cylinder beads. I'm going to pull tight as I go because these have a tendency to sort of flare outward, but I want this row to be tight, so it goes straight down. It's going to go straight down from the bezel to the non-woven stitching base of the mask. And I'm going to step up the end of the row. like always. Alright, so now see it's even deeper still. I may still have a couple more rows to add. We're getting there though. I'm going to add another row and see how that looks. And this is sort of just my preferred bezel method. It's not the only way to create bezels for your stones and have them sit on the mask base. In fact, there are many stones that you can bezel and they will sit more nicely on the mask base without doing any of this extra work to add these extra rows. Like if you're using like a fancy navette or even a Rivoli, which has a much slighter point. It's not as deep of a point on the back as this chaton. Those you can all kind of bezel and then just stitch down onto the mask base. And sometimes you can kind of see where there's a little gap between the outside edge of the row of cylinder beads and the mask base, and in that case sometimes I'll just add larger beads around the bezel, which is a nice embellishment as well. Like I'll add pearls or bicones or something sparkly. Alright, so I think this is going to do it. I just stepped up, and so I now have 3 extra rows of cylinder beads. Yep, that's going to be good. So now see how that just sits flush. Now to stitch this bezel to the mask base, I'm going to hold it in place and just wherever my thread is coming out. Oh yeah, I wove in the tail thread, by the way. Wherever the thread is coming out, I'm holding this firmly and pinching it in place. I would do the same on my mask base. Just hold it firmly in place, stitch straight down through the non-woven stitching base right next to the place where my thread is emerging from that cylinder bead. And then stitch like a few beads width away, still holding my assembly firmly in place. I'm trying to stitch up near another bead in that last row that I added. So see how I'm coming up right before an up bead in that row of peyote stitch. And I'm going to stitch through that up bead and then down right after the place where the thread is coming out of that up bead. I'm going to try to rotate this without moving it too much. So I can again stitch up near one of these beads. You can also catch threads when you're doing this rather than beads. That works too. If you're stitching up from the back of the non-woven, you can stitch between beads, catch a thread, and then stitch back down. There's no reason why you can't do that. I've done that many times. So yeah, there are lots of different ways to do these techniques. And you don't have to stitch through every single bead in this row. I'm trying to just make at least, I'd say I tried for at least 4 or 5 stitches of the bezel to the non-woven, to the mask base. And that's enough to sort of keep it firmly planted. I'm going to do one more here. And it is important to pull tight as you go so the stitches don't loosen up. And there you have it. A bezel very firmly stitched to the non-woven surface. The second way to add large embellishment beads in a row around a bezel is to pick up 1 or 2 beads at a time, stitch down through the non-woven base, then back up from back to front through the non-woven, close to where the beginning of that bead is, and then through the bead again. So this is basic single bead backstitch. And notice I'm not stitching right up against the bezel because this bead has some thickness to it. So I need the needle is where the center of the hole of the bead is, and I need there to be some thickness, some width between my needle and my bezel for a space for half of that bead. When you're doing this, you can either go back one bead or go back 2 beads. With the larger stones, I like to just go back 1 bead usually. Excuse me, with the larger beads. And I know that I need 12 to go around here, so if you don't know how many you need, you can always do what I did in that first technique just to get the number of beads you need around the bezel, and then add them one at a time like this. So something I like to do after I have all my beads, my large beads in an embellishment row in place, is to just stitch around through all of the beads without stitching through the non-woven base, because this just helps them sometimes sit more nicely, helps them behave a little more. Because sometimes when you're adding them with backstitch or with couching, you can end up with them angled down toward the non-woven stitching base on one side or the other of the hole. And this just makes the hole kind of get oriented horizontally. This crystal banding is another material I've been working with a lot lately, and it's basically like cup chain. There's these little plastic cups that hold the chatons. Those are little chatons that are in place, and between the cups are 2 strands of thread. So the nice thing is you can just stitch those threads down really easily to any surface. So in order to use this, I'm going to actually use this going around this bezel and these bicones. I'm going to kind of lay this out and cut a piece of the banding that's slightly larger than I think I'm going to need. And then later, after I'm getting done stitching it, I'm going to trim away however many stones I need to. So I'm knotting a new piece of thread at the very end and sewing up through my non-woven stitching base between the back and the front, very close to one of those bicones. I'm going to place my crystal banding down, starting with the spot between the first and the second stone, and I'm going to stitch on the other side of this thread between the stones. So my thread is going to hold, my beading thread is going to hold that thread of the crystal banding down against the non-woven. And I'm going to just sort of bend my crystal banding, trying to keep it flat, flush against the non-woven stitching base. I'm going to move to the next spot and just stitch that inside thread down. I'm only stitching the inside threads down right now, and I'll go and stitch the outside threads down later. So the trick is to try to get it to lay flat while doing this. I'm sort of holding down a few stones ahead with my fingers so that the whole thing stays flat while I'm stitching. And also so that it's a nice circular configuration around these bicones. I'm making sure my stitches are very small, very close to the threads on the banding, so that I'm not skewing the circular shape that I'm going after. Sometimes it takes a few tries for me to stab through in the right place. So when I'm doing that, just to show you what that looks like on the back side, I'm kind of holding my needle and just kind of making very small movements to prick through, see where I can get through, and checking with my eyes on the front where that starting the point of the needle is coming through. Now I'm getting closer to the end that I've cut, and I can see that I'm probably going to need to trim off these last two stones. So I'll just snip those right off. And it's going to be a little tight of a fit, but it's good to do this when you still have a few stones unattached, so that you can sometimes you can kind of finagle the positioning of these stones to make everything work out. Like I can kind of squish these together. It's going to force these couple back here to be a little more squished up, but if you're doing it, that squishing over like 3, 4, 5 stones distance, rather than just 1 or 2, it's going to be less noticeable that you've had to kind of finagle it. And actually that stitch isn't that great. It's kind of pulling everything out of whack. I'm going to stitch the other thread here down too to try to force this stone to stay in place here. And then I'll move on to this last spot here. I'm going to stitch the outside thread down to force this puppy in place. And then the inside thread. And now the spots where stones come together that aren't where the banding is cut can be tricky. One thing you can do is put a little dab of glue on the underside of these two stones and stick them down in place. That's something I've definitely done on my masks to get the ends of the crystal banding to stay in place. If you have little threads hanging from the banding, the cups, like I do here, you can also try to stitch those down, although it only works if you have like a larger piece of thread. I'm not sure I have enough here to catch. I'm gonna try. Nope. So what I'll do is I'll just put glue on the undersides of these to get them to stay down. And I'll do that later. What I'm going to do now is hold those in place, start stitching down the outside thread between each of these stones. So the inside threads are already stitched. I'm just stitching the outside threads, so everything lies nice and flat. Alright, to make paw vines like the ones in my Sweet Summer Child mask or Midsummer Night's Vine, you need at least 2 colors of 11-0s and a 15-0, and then in addition, later on you'll need a size 8-0 seed bead as well. So in this case, I'm going to be doing the demo just like the directions. The green is going to be the 11A, This pink color is my 11B. That chartreuse color is my 15-0. So you're going to start by picking up 3 11-0s. Bring them down toward the end of your thread. You want to leave just enough of a tail to weave in and trim later. You're not going to be using it for any beadwork. Come on, camera. I'm trying to get my document camera to focus on where I am. Here we are. Okay. There's my 3 11-0s. I'm going to stitch through the first one again to form a loop. And then directions don't explicitly say this, but if you want, you can go around a second time just to kind of lock this in place. This is the base of the first PRA unit, and this is 3 PRA, 3-sided prismatic right angle weave. So my thread's coming out of that first 11A. I'm going to pick up 1 11B and 2 11As. And I'm going to stitch through that first 11A in the base again in a circular fashion. So I'm going through it the same direction I went through it last time. And forming a loop. And I'm going to go through the next 11A in the base. Pick up 2 11As. Stitch down through the 11B toward the base and through the 11A in the base at the same time. It's always helpful to do this stitch at the same time, or to go through these 2 beads at the same time rather. That's my second wall. My first wall was there with the 3 beads. Second wall has 2 beads. Now I'm going to travel a little bit through the next 11A in the base. Then up through the side 11A in the first wall. I'm going to pick up a new 11A. Come on, camera. Stitch all the way across down through the 11A on the side of the second wall and through the 11A in the base as well. And then I'm going to stitch up through the side 11A in the first wall again. And that completes the third wall. Then I'm going to step up. I'm looking at the top now here. I'm going to step up through the first 11A of that group of 3 on the top of this unit I've just formed. I always want to step up through the one that makes my thread point toward my 11B. And I'm going to stitch around through the 3 beads again. 1, 2, 3, to reinforce that top of the unit, those 3 beads. I'm stopping when my thread is coming out just before that side 11B on the side of the first wall, and this is my first unit complete. I'm stepped up. I'm ready to do my second unit. These 3 beads on the top are going to become the base for my second unit. To stitch subsequent units off of the first, pick up 1 11B and 2 11As. Stitch through the same 11A in the base of the first, on the top of the first unit, in a circular fashion, so you form a little right angle weave unit there. Stitch through the next 11A in the base. Pick up 2 11As, stitch down through the 11B toward the base, and then through the 11A in the base again. Then through the next 11A in the base, and up through the side 11A in the first wall. Then pick up another 11A, stitch through the 11A on the opposite side down toward the base, and through the 11A in the base you just passed through again. pull tight and make sure that the bead you just added sits to the front toward you. And pull tight. That completes the third unit and sort of forms the PRA unit. Stitch up through the side 11A in the first wall, then step up through the next 11A with your needle pointing toward the 11B. Stitch around through all three of these 11A's on top. 1, 2, 3. That completes the second unit. Keep making subsequent units the same way you made that unit until you have your desired length for your PRA vine. If you want, you can always extend the length of your vine later on from the tail side by picking up your tail and working rows off of this side, or by adding a new thread there and working rows off that side. If you need to know the number of units in your PRA strip, you can just count your 11 Bs. Since there's one per unit, this is an easy way to count how many units you have. They should all be in a single column. If they aren't in a single column, you've done something different than the directions as far as your step up or where you started your new unit off of the last unit. Now I'm following along right with the directions for this particular PRA vine example, but you can add different numbers of beads than what I'm showing you, and it's good to experiment and figure out what's going to work best for you. You can change the size and the shape based on how many of each of these things I'm going to show you that you end up doing. So the first step, once you've got your PRA vine that's long enough, is to stitch down through the next 11B. So I've stepped up through this 11A, that's how I stop all my units. I'm stitching down through that next 11A, headed down the column toward the opposite end. I'm going to pick up one 8/0. This is where the 8/0 seed beads come into play. You can try different size beads from 8/0s as well. You could try 2mm fire polish beads, 2mm rounds. You can try even larger beads if you want to see how it makes the PRA vine curve. I'm stitching through the next 11B here. So that's just peyote stitch, adding the 11Bs in each space. I mean the 8/0s in each space. I'm going to repeat this 5 times for a total of 6 8/0s. Alright, so there's my 6 8/0s. So you can see, based on the brand that I used of 8/0s, I'm getting just a very slight curve. They're not super thick, so I'm thinking they're Miyukis. If you use Tohos, they're going to be slightly thicker, or Matsunos. And they're going to cause the end of the vine to curve a little bit more. So if I were to add larger beads in those spaces, the vine would curve more, just depending on the size. So that's something else you can play around with. Now I'm going to add one 11C in the last space. Oh, I need a third color of 11/0. You could add an 11B or an 11A in the last space. The color doesn't super matter, but I just forgot that in the directions I had you add a third color. So I'm adding an 11C in this space. And then I'm going to repeat that 3 times for a total of 4. Another thing you can do is match this to your 8/0 color. But what this is doing is it's creating a reinforced part of the PRA vine on the spine here that's going to be straighter than the part with the 8/0s. Alright, so now I'm going to do sort of a turnaround by stitching through the 3 beads here that they were the base of a unit of PRA. So I'm sort of changing direction. I'm going to a 90-degree angle now, and I'm rotating as I work through these 3 beads. And then I'm going to stitch back through that last 11B that I stitched through, and then the 11Cs, and I'm going to just work my way back up this spine with the added beads. I might not be able to go all the way back to the end in one pass. I might have to do several passes, especially if you have a more extreme curve on the end. And I'm going to bring my thread out of that last 11B in that last unit. After coming out that last 11B in that last unit, I'm going to stitch down through the next 11A in that same unit. I'm going to pick up 13 15-ohs, 4, 8, 12, 13, and I'm going to stitch through the 11A on the opposite side of the spine. So I'm kind of thinking of the spine as like the midline, and I'm going to look head on. I'm going to stitch through this 11A here toward the 11B in that unit. I'm going to pick up an 11C and stitch through the first 11A again, and then through 7 of the 15-ohs added. So I'm just stitching through 4 here. I'm going to pull tight and stitch through the other 3 I need to stitch through. I'm going to turn the beadwork over to this side and pick up 7 15-ohs. And I'm going to stitch through the 11A here, but away from the 11B. Oops. Okay. So then I'm going to turn this over to the bottom and stitch through this unused 11A that's sort of at the bottom of this triangular configuration of 3 11As. And I'm turning the beadwork back over to the front, and I'm going to stitch through the next 11A in the PRA unit, which is this guy. And then I'll pick up 7 15-ohs. And stitch through the 7th 15-oh in the initial group of 15 15-ohs. So that's can be tricky to remember, but it was this group right here that's more toward the bottom. So I'm counting 1 2 3 4 5 6 7. I'm going through the 7th one there. And then I'm going to turn this over and stitch through the next 6 15-ohs from the initial group, which are the ones more toward the bottom if we're holding the spine up like that, and then through that 11A. And then I'm going to stitch through that 11C as well. So I'm going to turn this over to the front, stitch through that next 11A on the end of the PRA without stitching through any of the 15-ohs, and then through the next 11A at a 90-degree angle. So now I'm heading down the PRA toward the start. Alright, so again I want to reiterate, I'm just following the directions, which are an example of a PRA vine. If you wanted to make a larger frond than what you'll see happening here, you need more beads in these initial loops. You always want it to be an odd count, but you can increase the initial number from 7 to up to 20 even to make this longer, and then you'll have more distance to work more of these little frondy bits that I'm going to be working right now. You'll add more beads in each of these stitches as well. So from here I'm going to pick up 5 15As, or 15Os I should say. I should have changed that in the diagrams, I forgot. 2, 3, 4, 5 15Os. And I'm going to stitch through the 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st 15Os in this loop back here. some sort of back stitching almost. I'm going through bead number 1, 2, 3, and 4, but in reverse direction, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So I'm forming a new little loop here. And I also want to mention that this side that we're working on right now, this is going to be the front side. You really only need to do this frondy bit on the front side, whatever is going to be the front side of your vine when you're working, when you're planning this to go on your mask. So if you want your prop vine to be the opposite orientation, like this, you need to start on this side instead. But we're starting on this side, so this is going to end up being the front side of the prop vine. Alright, then I'm going to stitch through this next 11A here. Then pick up a 15-0 and stitch through the next 11A down the column of PRA. So it's in the next unit. So that brings us over to the next unit. I'm going to pick up 4 15As. Again, this count could be more if you're making a larger frond or you're doing more iterations of this. I'm going to stitch through the third, second, and first 15-0 in that previous loop toward the PRA. And then I'm going to stitch through the 15-0 added between PRA units and through the next 11A down the PRA. Hold tight. I'm going to pick up a 15-0 and stitch through the next 11A down the column of PRA. I'm going to pick up 4 15-0s again and then stitch through the second and the first 15-0 in this previous loop. Then through the 15-0 between PRA units and the 11A after that. So see what we're doing? We're forming these loops of beads that are becoming progressively and slowly smaller as we work down the column of PRA to sort of graduate the shape of the frond from larger to smaller. So I'm going to pick up a 15-0 and stitch through the next 11A. Then I'm going to pick up 4 15-0s again. You could do this as many times as you want. If you're picking up the same number of beads though, you're going to just you're going to have the same width here. I'm going to stitch through the second and the first 15-0 in that previous loop of beads, then through the 15-0 between PRA units and the 11A. Pick up a 15-0 and stitch through the next 11A down the PRA. I'm going to pick up 3 15As for this one, so I'm getting smaller now. Stitch through the second and the first 15-0 in this previous loop of beads, then through the 15-0 between PRA units and the next 11A. Pick up a 15-0 and stitch through the next 11A. Oops, I looped around the whole thing. Reference my directions here. I'm going to pick up 2 15-0s and stitch through just the first 15-0 here in the previous loop, then through the 15-0 between PRA units and the next 11A. And then that's where I'm going to stop it. I'm going to add just one more 15A and stitch through the next 11A. So that gives me a little frond. Now if you wanted to, you could make this two-sided by going through and starting at the 11A up on this side and just repeating that process of adding the loop-to-loops of 15-0s as you work your way down. If you're using your PRA vines as sort of an extension for off the top of your mask and you need some extra reinforcement, you can use memory wire. That's what I've used to go inside the PRA vine, and this will sort of force your PRA vines to keep their shape. So this is just a steel memory wire. It's approximately 20 gauge. I'm not sure the exact gauge, but it's thin enough that it can fit right down the column of PRA. So what I do is I cut a piece that is longer than my actual provine. And then I'm kind of working it hard, working it to straighten it out a little bit because it comes on these spools and it's already curved a bit. And then I'm going to just, starting at the bottom of the praw, insert it into the center of the praw, and let me refocus. I'm just making sure I'm not getting it through any beads, but it's just going down the column of praw until I reach the end. Now it can come out the end, and one thing that I like to do to prevent it from popping out the end later is I'll just make one little loop using some pliers. It's a little hard to bend. That's the point, is we want this to stay in place once we have it with the configuration in the shape that we want. So now I'm going to pull it back, and it's more likely to stay in place now with the little loop on the end there. So now I have my shaped vine, and in order to stitch this to the mask base, what I'll do sometimes is I will make a large loop on this end using just, again, some pliers. You can use flat nose, chain nose, or round nose. You just want to get the wire to bend over. And you just want to work it as little as possible because it can get work worn and then become brittle and break. But I like to make some kind of loop like that and then just trim it. And then I'm going to sew it to the top of my mask base, like this. So I'll actually pick up the tail thread to do that. So once I know where this is going on my mask, I'm sort of overlaying the wire part onto the mask base, and I'm using my tail thread to just stitch the wire down on the base. I'm trying to make little stitches so the wire doesn't move around too much. And I mean, you really want to reinforce these stitches a lot. You can actually have the praw come onto the mask base as well. You don't have to have it sitting right on the edge like I have, but it can go on top of the mask base. It'll just be thicker where you do that. And you just, by having this loop here, you can sew down both sides, and it keeps the praw vine in the direction that you want it, so it doesn't twist around. If you don't have a loop there, the wire can just twist, and this thing can then move around. So something else you can do once you have this stitched in place is you can actually add extra units of right angle weave to sort of blend the praw vine onto the mask base. So you can pick up two 11A's and an 11B and add them in right angle weave fashion, and then just sort of keep going and make a little strip that you can then stitch down to the mask base as far down as you want it to go. This is my initial row of beads. This is what's going to be down the center of the petal or the leaf. And this is the base down here where the 11 O's started. This is going to be the tip up here where the last 15 O's are. And I'm going to work around peyote stitching off both sides to build up my leaf or my petal. So I'm going to reverse direction and immediately stitch back through the fourth 15-0 from the end. Oh, I got to refocus. Okay. To create a picot, you can have a stop bead on the tail end if you like, or just hold on to the tail thread. I like to just hold on to the tail thread so that later on I can just pick it up with a needle and weave it into the leaf to secure it before trimming it. Or you can use that end to attach the petal to your mask base or to another petal. Alright, so I'm going to peyote stitch with 15 O's along this strip of 15 O's till I get to my first bead that's different. I'm holding it too tight so I can't get into the bead. Okay, there we go. So there's my first peyote stitch. They're not going to sit super nice like cylinder beads would because they're seed beads. So they're going to be a little wonky. This is going to be a little twisty and turny, but that's okay. It'll straighten out later when you add the other rows. Alright, so now that I'm through that last 15 before the cylinder beads start, I'm going to switch over to cylinders. I'm going to pick up a cylinder, stitch through the next cylinder bead, and peyote stitch, or skip one and stitch through the next one. I'm going to peyote stitch one more. And then just continue to the end. If you want there to be more of a cup on the bottom part of the leaf or petal, you can add more 11-ohs and fewer cylinder beads. Like these 3 cylinder beads here and this one could be 11-ohs instead. That'll create a more severe cupping effect toward the base. So I recommend, I usually end up trying a few different ways of doing the petals or leaves for any given project before I decide on which technique or which combination of beads I want. So this last one is odd count. I'm going to pick up a cylinder bead and stitch into that last cylinder bead toward the tip of the leaf. And then I need to do an odd count turnaround. Or do I? Yeah. I'm going to do an odd count turnaround to sort of lock this in place. So I'm stitching through the next 2 beads toward the tip. Then reversing direction and stitching through the adjacent bead and then back through that 11-oh, the cylinder bead at the bottom, pulling that stitch tight, and then I'm going to reverse direction one more time and stitch through the adjacent cylinder bead. Alright, so now the bulk of the rest of the peyote stitch is going to be just cylinder beads. In these areas down here, the cylinder beads are going to be the same size or slightly smaller than the beads that are already in place. In the area up here, the cylinder beads are going to be slightly larger than the beads that are in place here. So you're going to get the leaf curving in one direction down here and in the opposite direction up here. So I'm going to work my way along one edge, just peyote stitching cylinder beads as I go. In the very last space, I'll peyote stitch a 15-oh. When I pull tight, you can already see there's some curving happening here. So I'm at the last space where I'm going to add a 15-oh. Stitch through the last bead on the side, then through that tip bead and that little picot I formed. I'm turning this over to work in this direction now. I'm going to stitch through the next bead down toward the base and pull tight. If you want this shaping effect, the tighter you're able to pull, the more dramatic your shaping is going to be. So I'm going to peyote stitch a 15-oh in this first space, and then peyote stitch cylinder beads all along this edge. So this is the same row as the row I just finished, just in reverse order because I'm starting at the tip and working down toward the base instead of starting at the base and working toward the tip. Now my tail thread is loosening up a little bit At any point you feel comfortable, you can weave in that tail thread or just weave it around a little bit to sort of lock it in place so that it doesn't loosen up the stitches that are attached to it. That can be helpful in the shaping as well. So I'm peyote stitching this last space here with a cylinder bead, and then I'm going to reverse direction and stitch up through the 2 cylinder beads on the other side to step up. In this first position here, I'm going to peyote stitch a 15-0 and then cylinder beads until I get to the last space where I'm going to add a 15-0. Alright, so this is the last space. I'm adding a 15-0 and stitching through all the beads in the tip to reverse direction so I can work the other side. And I'm pulling really tight. I'm stopping and pausing to pull that row tight and pull the tail thread tight. Alright, so I'm going to add that same row now in reverse order. Alright, so now I'm back down at the bottom, and you can kind of see how I'm getting some cupping down at the bottom here especially. I'm going to reverse direction and stitch through the adjacent cylinder bead and then the next 2 beads to step up. I'm also then going to stitch beyond there through the next 2 cylinder beads, because what I want to happen is I want the base of my petal or my leaf here to be thinner, narrower than the top, so I'm going to be skipping these spaces. So I'm advancing a little further so that these spaces will be, this part of the leaf will be done, and I'll just keep working these areas closer to the tip now. Alright, so oh, I actually advanced too far. I spoke too soon on that advancing. I wasn't supposed to do that till after the next row. But I mean, I could do that, but just in the interest of following the directions, I'm going to add a 15-0 in this first space after that 15-0, and then peyote stitch my cylinder beads along this edge. Oops. And then a 15-0 in the last spot. It's always a 15-0 in the last spot. And then weaving through all the beads in the tip. If at any point they get too full of thread, you have to kind of find an alternate thread path around to the other side. If you're making your petal a lot wider, that's almost inevitable. On these really small petals, you can kind of get away with not having to do that, but the wider you make it, the more likely you're going to have to make that alternate thread path to get around the tip. So I just put my 15-0 in place, and now I'm adding cylinder beads and peyote stitch, working down toward the base. And then the last space down here, I'll add a 15-0. So I'm matching my second side to my first. And I'll stitch through the next cylinder and reverse direction and stitch up through these 4 beads on this side, and then this is where I'm advancing through 2 more beads so that the bottom part of the leaf is narrower. Alright, now this is the second to last row. On the last row or the second to last row, I usually add just 15-ohs, and this is what sort of makes the leaf shape a little more dramatically. In this case, I'm going to add 2 rows of 15-ohs, so this is the second to last row. Pull really tight. If you turn this to the side, you can see how this part here at the top sort of is puffing this way, and down here there's sort of a little bowl where the back side is puffing out that way. That's because of the different bead sizes. Now I'm stitching through all these beads in the tip. I'm going to add an identical peyote stitch row with 15-ohs here. And then stopping there. I usually double check to make sure both sides of my leaf are symmetrical after finishing that second row, because it's easy to make mistakes doing that. If you do make a mistake and just wind up leaving it in, it's just a little bit of variation. I've made flowers where I'll have a couple petals that are just a little bit different, but you really can't tell once you put everything together, because the overall effect is just a bunch of petals. And now I'm stepping up through that first 15-oh I added on this side, and I'm doing my final row with peyote stitching just 15-ohs. And when I get to the tip here, I'm going to make sure I pull really tight, and that tension will help the leaf really curve. I'm kind of forcing it with my finger too. So now I'm getting a more dramatic curving at the top here. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get through these beads at the tip, or if I'm going to, nope, I'm going to have to find another way around. So I'm just going to weave, make sure I pull tight as I weave so that that last row I did doesn't loosen up on me. I'm just weaving up and down, back and forth to get to these beads on the other side. And then I'm going to peyote stitch this final row with 15-ohs here. Pull tight. So then I would leave this thread hanging if I want to attach this to another one, or weave in, secure, and trim it, or use it to attach my petal to my base. But you can see how it's very three-dimensional now. So I consider this sort of the front side and this the back side. But depending on what kind of leaf or flower you're emulating, you could use it in the opposite way if you wanted to. So we're going to start with our first bottom bead. It's going to be this mauve color. This is my A color. My B color is a green color. I'm going to bring it down toward the end of my thread. I leave just enough tail thread to like weave in later or use to stitch the fern down. I'm going to stitch through a second time just to make it act like a stop bead. Oops, my needle just came off my thread, sorry. Alright, so then I'm going to pick up my second and third beads, which are actually my first pair of beads. I'm going to be referencing the table in a little bit, And these next two beads I'm picking up are my second and third bead, but also just the first pair of beads. I'm going to stitch through this bottom bead again in a circular fashion. Oops, and those are the wrong colors, but anyway, I'm going to stitch through the first bead again. Turn this over so I'm working in the same direction as the directions. And then I'm going to add the second pair. So in this case it's 2 A's. Stitch down through the adjacent bead in that first pair. Whoops. I feel like I'm zoomed in too much because I can't see what I'm doing. There. And then up through the second bead in the first pair and the second bead in the second pair. So I'm skipping over that bottom bead. So then I'll add the third pair the same way. In this case it's 2 A's. I'm stitching down through the adjacent A in the previous pair. And then up through the second bead in the pair previous and the second bead in the current pair. And pull tight. So this is how I'm just going to keep stacking my pairs of beads. I've got, for my next pair of beads, I'm going to refer to the chart on page 28. I'm going to scale back here and show you how I'm going to follow the chart. So I've just added my first pair of beads. I used the wrong colors, but it should have been an A and an A. My second pair of beads, an A and an A. My third pair of beads, an A and an A. My fourth pair of beads in this pinna needs to be an A and a B. My fifth pair will be a B and a B. I'll have 3 more pairs of B's after that, then a pair of 15 O's, and then the top bead will be a B. What can be helpful when you're reading this chart is to use a piece of paper or something else flat to place underneath the line you're reading, and the pinna, the pairs of beads in the pinna go across like this. So you start here and work your way this way. And what I like to do, and what you can do, is lay out these pairs of beads ahead of time and then pick them up as you go. So now I'll continue stitching those pairs of beads. You gotta refocus. So I just did 3 pairs. I am on my 4th pair of beads, which is going to be an A and a B. I'm going to put it here. Then I'm going to need a pair of B's, 3 more pairs of B's. I know it's kind of blurry and out of focus, but I will show you in a second. A pair of 15 O's and my top bead. So I've just laid those all out right there. So I'm going to pick them up from bottom to top. So for my next pair, I'm picking up this A and B. I did them in the order that came off my needle because I pick up my beads easier from right to left. So I'm adding this next pair of beads in the same way, this sort of herringbone stitch or ladder stitch. Always going down through one and then up through two. Oops. It can be easy for this to loosen up as you go, so sometimes what I do is just try to really pull on the thread to get the previous pairs of beads to tighten up. I like to get them to sit nice before I pull tight and stitch up through them again. Alright, so I've just added the last pair of beads, which is two 15-ohs, and I'm adding my top bead, which is a B, and I'm going to stitch down this entire column of beads until my needle's coming out of a bead in the second to last pair. I feel like I need to refocus again because this isn't super clear. Okay. So coming out the second to last bead, that's where I'm going to start my next pinna. It's offset a little bit, it's up a little higher than the very bottom of this pinna. So looking at my chart, this is going to be pinna 2. The first bead I'm going to add, just a ladder to the previous pinna, is an A. And then the second and third bead added are going to be an A and an A. So I'll show you what that means. So the first bead added, that would be 1A. I'm picking it up and I'm stitching through that same bead my thread is coming out of again in a circular fashion to ladder those two beads together. And I'm going to stitch through that same bead I just added again. Second and third bead added are an A and an A. So I'm picking those up and I'm going to stitch up through the bottom of that bead I just added. So now I have in place my bottom bead and my first pair of beads in the pinna. So then I can continue reading my chart. I just did this, so the next pair I'll need to add is an A and a B, and then I'll have another 1, 2, 3 AB pairs, then 2 BB pairs, and 1 pair of 15-ohs before I add the top bead. So that next pair is an A and a B. I'm going to add this, trying to hold my beadwork that I did previously tight so nothing gets loosened up. Stitch up through these two beads in this column, and then I'm going to ladder stitch this bead my thread is coming out of to the adjacent bead in the other pinna, the first pinna, and then up through that first bead again. I'm doing that so that I can have these pinnae be attached together at least part way up. So I'll do it to the first few pairs I add to this pinna, but then I'll leave the last few pairs just detached. I'll show you on one of the finished ferns. So they're sort of attached 3, 4, sometimes 5 pairs up, depending on how long each pinna is, but then the ends are loose so that they have more movement and they're separate from each other. Alright, so you just keep going. Alright, so to make this curly cute end, again we're picking up a pair of 11s, stitching through the last 11-oh in that last pinna, and then I'll stitch through the first of those two beads again. Ladder one more pair of 11-ohs to that first pair added. And then I'll start adding a 15-0 and an 11-0 in each pair. And ladder those to the previous pairs. Now you can change this combination of beads. You can do more pairs with just 11-0s if you want more of a straight section for the curlicue, or you can just not even add any pairs of 11-0s. You can just start right off the bat with a 15-0 and 11-0 if you like, if you want the curl to start sooner. I recommend like playing around with different combinations to see what you get. But I'll add a few of these pairs of beads, the 15-0 and the 11-0, till I get a curl that I like. And then when you're happy with the curl, you can either just add a single bead in that space, or you can add, sometimes I'll add like a few of the 15-0s and a few of the 11-0s. And then stitch down through the column of 11-0s, the outside column of beads, till I get to that first pair. And then stitch through that next 11B sort of toward the first bottom bead on this side, and then through the bottom bead. Alright, so that's the first side completed. This little guy is the second side completed. It's a lot smaller than the first side because I want my fern to be asymmetrical. I want one side to be thicker than the other. You could do these totally symmetrical, but I think the asymmetry kind of makes them look more three-dimensional when they're attached to the mask base. So what you'll do to zip these together is take a bead that's slightly larger, like a size 8-0 seed bead, and you'll start stitching between the bottom beads on each side and incorporating an 8-0 in some of the spots to kind of take up some of the space. You could use other things other than an 8-0. You could use a 3mm fire polish bead. You could use a crystal that's around that size, a pearl. You know, you could play around and try different combinations of things. So I'm actually going to stitch through the first bottom bead on the second side without adding anything, and then through the second bottom bead on the first side. So this is starting the zipping process. Alright, now I'm going to pick up an 8-0, and I'm going to stitch through the next bottom bead on this same side, and then the bottom bead on the second side. I'll stitch through the next bottom bead on the first side, pick up an 8-0, stitch through the next bottom bead on this first side. I'm stitching through more beads on the first side because I have more bottom beads on this side than this side. So I have to ultimately stitch through more of these guys on the larger side than the smaller side. So that's why I'm stitching it in this way and not just back and forth. Now I'll stitch through the next bottom bead on the second side and the next bottom bead on the first side. And I do this honestly just organically as I'm creating my ferns, and then if I want my piece to be symmetrical where I have ferns on both sides, what I'll do is I'll take my first one as an example and copy it when I'm making the second one. But in general, what I want is I want the ends the ends of each side to kind of come together. So I'm going to do the same thing as before, pick up an 8/0, stitch through the bottom bead on this side. Oops. Ooh, we're getting a little tangly here. There's lots of tail threads hanging. And then I'll go through the next bottom bead on this second side. Come on. Pick up another 8/0, go through the next bottom bead on the first side, then the next bottom bead on the second side. Easier said than done. Oops, I split my thread somehow around that bead. Alright, just need to take a moment to untangle this mess. Wow, look at that. Lovely. Alright, so I wanted to stitch through this bead here. I think I actually stitched through it and then created that mess. Alright, so I'm through that bead, and then I have one more 8/0 to add. And I'll stitch through this first bottom bead here, and then the first bottom bead on that second side. So I've just zipped the whole thing together. So I have my little curly fern.